Anyway, let's pray. Almighty and eternal God, so draw our hearts to thee, so guide our minds, so fill our imaginations, so control our wills, that we may be wholly thine, utterly dedicated unto thee. And then use us, we pray thee, as thou wilt, and always to thy glory and the welfare of thy people. Through our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ.
Amen. You want to go first, or?
We can do either. So you're going to talk about how to do prep, and I'm going to talk about why don't I start off? So you guys, did you see the email I sent earlier today about resources? Okay, you'll see it when you get home. And I'm going to just go through it anyway. I just figured rather than printing off a bunch of URLs, which would be dumb, I would just email them to you so you can have hyperlinks. So I'm going to just kind of talk a little bit about, here we go, resources. No Tom. Tom is, he's backing out. He's got a lot going on with the winter. He's just a little bit like, it's just too many things, which is understandable. Yeah. So, talk a little bit about resources we use for preaching. I'm going to just kind of caveat this by saying that it is possible and not even all that unreasonable to start preparation of a sermon without ever looking stuff up, but also it can be helpful to look up stuff. So like, it's okay to start off doing sermon prep by saying, I have this on my heart and on my mind, and this is not like so theologically challenging that I'm going to speak heresy from the pulpit, right? You can do that. But there are resources out there too to kind of help you. So the first, I'm just gonna, since I don't have like a big screen, I'm just gonna pull up various websites that I've compiled, and I emailed all these to you, so you can take a look. So first of all is to look at the lectionary. You might wonder, where do we get our readings from? Maybe you never did wonder. I don't know. If you're, on an island somewhere in the middle of nowhere and have no internet, there is good news. You have a Book of Common Prayer.
Nobody goes to islands without that.
Absolutely. So you'll see starting on page 889, you have what is the Revised Common Lectionary. Some older prayer books will have a different lectionary. So that is just something to keep in mind. They updated the lectionary after the Book of Common Prayer. The Book of Common Prayer is older than me, so,
A lot.
Not a lot. Well, by 4 years, really, because it was originally introduced in 1976 and then formally approved in 1979. I was born in 1980, so it is 4 years older than me. And we're having these conversations now about what will it look like to revise again. Because, it's been a while. It's been a minute. We're bumping up to 50 years. Yeah. This is what happens, theology and language, the way we use words has changed even since the prayer book. And that does get a little funny. Not often, but every once in a while. That reminds me, a guy from the Diocese of New Jersey, I try to say this as charitably as possible, created in the early 2000s a hip-hop prayer book.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, actually there may be a copy downstairs. I think I saw one. I have one at home. Never used it. I got it just out of a little bit of a curiosity, but it's kind of interesting. It was a good idea. It's really an interesting concept. Anyway, whatever. In the back of the prayer book, you have the Revised Common Lectionary. So the hardest thing to keep track of where we are is whether we're near A, B, or C. And really, that's just kind of you gotta kind of keep track of it kind of thing. Year A will mostly be gospel readings from Matthew. Year B will mostly be gospel readings from, guess which one? Yep, there you go, from Mac from Boston. Yeah. Mark, with a lot of John, because Mark is a really short gospel, so they got to, actually. They do pair well together, yeah. Well, yes, I mean, we can talk about source criticism. Huh? Yes, they do. Well, there's a lot of thematic, yes. Anyway. Year C, then, of course, is Luke, right? So that makes sense, right? So we've been hearing a lot of the Gospels. Have you guys thought about, what have we been hearing a lot of Gospel readings the last year? Anybody remember? We've been reading a lot of Luke, which means we're in year what? C, there we go. All right. So those are the biggest things to keep track of. And then, of course, it gets a little hairy to keep track of what exactly day we're on, because we're, in the middle of this ginormous green season. So those things. But if you do look, say, like on year A, I mean, it's pretty easy for Advent, right? I mean, you count back 4 weeks from Christmas. Well, there's always the secret, too, which is hey, Paul, can you get me a reading insert for this week? Yeah, I mean, that's the really easy. Yeah. So, but then you've got, all the Christmas Day, and then you get the Epiphany, January 6th, all the Sundays of Epiphany. Ash Wednesday is another one that's a little hard to keep track of because it falls 46 days before Easter. And when is Easter? Well, of course, it's the same time every year. The first Sunday on or after the first full moon on or after the spring equinox, which is the golden number, which is based on an ancient computation, all that business, right? Yeah, and it just anyway, yeah, so... because Sundays are excluded from Lent. Or Holy Week is excluded from Lent, depending on who you ask. Yeah, it's typically Sundays are excluded from Lent. That's why it says, you'll notice it'll say Sundays after Epiphany. So say second Sunday of Advent, you'll see it says after Christmas, after Epiphany, and then you'll see first Sunday in Lent. So those prepositions are incredibly important. Then you have Holy Week, Easter, Monday in Easter week, fifth Sunday of Easter. So see, those prepositions actually speak quite a lot of volume. And then you get into this weird season after Pentecost, which is not called Pentecost season, it's called ordinary time. We had a former, I guess I can say this. We had a former bishop who always said there was no such thing as ordinary time, but it's right there. Anyway, it's true. And then you have what are called, then they're just, the propers are numbered, and you can see the closest two dates, which generally gives you a good sense of when they are. There's also this little problem in here where you'll see, like, if you look on, say, 898, and you look at, like, proper 10, you'll say, okay, you've got Genesis or Isaiah. That's track 1, and that's track 2. So track 1 is, so these are, the way the RCL, the Revised Common Lectionary, works is it gives you 2 Old Testament tracks. One, which is, the first track is called semi-continuous. So that means that if you wanted to, like, say, preach on the life of, where are we at here? Genesis 25, that'd be about what, like, yeah, I was going to say Isaac, Jacob, thereabouts. Yeah, if you want to preach about the patriarchs there and do a series on the patriarchs, boy, midsummer, you could do a whole sermon series on the patriarchs of Genesis because they're all, there's the story running right through Genesis, semi-continuous. It skips a bit because there's a lot in the middle, like nobody wants to sit there and read. And Methuselah begat Jehoshaphat, who lived to 100 and, right. Yeah, all that business. So it skips over a lot of that kind of stuff that's sort of, there, and it's important in its own way. Yeah.
So the priest gets to choose?
No. Well, so what happens is, the practical part of this is the church has to order bulletin inserts. So you have to order according to a tract for a year. So usually we just have a tract. So tract 2 then is thematic. And that means it matches the gospel thematically. So since I've been here and I just haven't bothered to change, so at St. Matthew's I used to change every year. Year 1 I would do tract daily office lectionary. So odd number of years I would do tract 1, even number of years I'd do tract 2, and I just switched back and forth and ordered different ones every year. And that way I figured everybody'd get a little more Bible over the course of 6 years. It made sense in my mind. But since I've been here, I haven't bothered to change them, so we've been on track 2. And until somebody else changes it, which could happen, but until someone else changes it, we're on track 2.
Now, where are you seeing the tracks?
We see here, it says Genesis 25, or if you look at it like 898 here, you look at proper 10, it says like Genesis 25.
Wait, hold on a second.
Oh, you got an old one. See, that's the old. They changed it around. They changed it in like 2006.
Yeah, I am home as an old one.
Yeah, that's still maybe an old one. Here, have this one. Sorry about that. That's the challenge. We've changed lectionaries, and it reminds me. This one time, I was working. This is just like emblematic of the Episcopal Church, but I worked in this bookstore. I worked in the seminary bookstore, and a lot of people would just come in because it was like the only Episcopal bookstore in the Chicago area. So I get these people come in all the time, which has like been it's just been like an unending source of great sermon stories. Just these people that would come in and But this one woman came in and she wanted a lectionary calendar, and this was right about the time we were changing lectionaries. And I said, do you want the BCP lectionary or the RCL? And she goes, what's the RCL? And I said, it's the Revised Common Lectionary. It's the lectionary that's been adopted by General Convention. And she goes, those priests! I was like, what? She goes, they're changing the prayer book without telling us. Those priests are always doing things like this. It happened at General Convention. Yeah, but they changed the prayer book. They didn't change the prayer book. They changed the lectionary. Well, the lectionary is in the prayer book, isn't it? I was like, well, so they changed the prayer book. Yeah. Anyway, 3597, please. Have a nice day.
So you're on back of the new here, 98.
Yeah, okay, so track 1 is at Genesis 25 and the Psalm 119. And then track 2 would be Isaiah 55 and Psalm 65. So that's how it's split. You'll notice that all of those propers there then have 2 tracks. And that's how it works throughout all the summer and fall green season. All during ordinary time has 2 tracks. If you really want to be weird and complicated about it, Epiphany, technically, the late Epiphany after February 2nd should have the same readings as propers 1, 2, and 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. the early propers, but it only goes with track 1, or track 2, rather, for reasons that I don't know. Anyway, so that's where the lectionary is found. There are, if you poke around the back, you've got A, B, and C. You've got holy days are, after that. So if, you happen to be, for some reason, celebrating the feast of St. Mary Magdalene on July 22nd, there are propers on 9/24 that show you what the Eucharistic readings are. And then I'm going to show you I already sent you the cheats for all this. Or various occasions on 9/28. And then you have daily office readings after that, which theoretically you could use if you had a morning prayer on a Wednesday of Advent 3. You've got readings on 9/38. So, not that many people really preach those kind of things, but there are there. So now that I've showed you the proper way, I'm going to tell you. One, of course, you can always get the readings. in the bulletin insert. Also, I emailed you a link to the lectionary page, which has it in very handy-dandy calendar form. So instead of like poking around or buying a lectionary book, you could go, oh, this Sunday is October 23rd. Let me click on it, and then I have all the readings right there.
Doesn't have it on there daily. Is that just Sundays?
This one only has Sundays except during Lent through Eastertide, which have daily verse readings. However, I did send you another link with a different lectionary, which has a daily lectionary, and this one's not as user-friendly, but you kind of have to know where you are in the year a little bit. But okay, so we're in proper, what did I say? We're currently in proper 24. So, like, today is the feast day of St. Luke. Happy St. Luke's Day. Hope you're all healthy and well. Anyway, so like you have the daily office readings that would just follow the regular cycle. You have the daily office readings for St. Luke, morning and evening prayer. Or you have daily Eucharistic readings, or these are the ones for St. Luke's Day, or there's a daily lectionary too that's on there. So that's another link I sent you that has all those kind of readings. The really nifty, handy-dandy thing about this one too is if you click on the Saints' Day, it gives you a little bio of their life and resources to learn about them. So were you to preach on St. Luke the Evangelist today, you have a little bio there. And it gives you some history. Or if you just, have this penchant for history, you can read all about it. And it gives you the collects and write one and write two collects for the day too. So that's another link I sent you. So those are two links, particularly the lectionary page. I mean, bookmark that one because that one's a one you'll want. And then getting into some just other resources I sent you. I'm wondering if I can just do this. I sent you an Amazon link here. If you want to, actually it's not too bad for $36. The New Oxford Annotated Bible, which is the NRSV. That's the version that we typically use in the Episcopal Church. We have about 20 or so authorized translations of the Bible that we can use in the Episcopal Church. But the NRSV, all the stuff's printed in NRSV. Anyway, I just recommend a good annotated Bible because the footnotes sometimes are incredibly interesting and helpful. So, you have one with good footnotes in it?
Yeah.
Yep.
That's the version I have. That's what this is.
Any annotated Bible, I mean, those are always helpful. The next one I sent you this is where I get into sometimes when you really start to struggle, especially if it's early in the week, I would not recommend using somebody else's sermon because that is plagiarism. But sometimes I read other people's sermon and then argue with them in my head for a week.
Sue said I should for this first sermon, I should go online and find a super famous, awesome somebody from 1800 or something.
And pirate it.
And just do it. Just copy it and just read it.
In these days of the great war between the states,
Yeah.
betwixt the states. Yeah. Anyway, you can actually read other people's sermons if you want to just argue with them a little bit in your head. So here's a sermon for this Sunday. And there you go. One for track 1 and one for track 2. You get 2. So if you, I don't even know who, that's, let's see here. Yeah, you got a sermon here. Oh, geez. I'll eventually get there. That one's written by the Venerable Irene Ignatius Mulliman. I don't know who that is. Oh, but she's at the Church of St. John the Divine in Guam. Anyway, don't steal someone else's sermon, but if you just want to sometimes early, I think in the process, or like a couple weeks ahead, I'll just go, I wonder what so-and-so has written on these crazy readings, or just to see what someone, usually I read someone else's sermon and I go, I don't like at all what they did, and here's what I would do differently. Ding.
What link is that?
I sent it to you. It just I sent all these to you. So that's the Episcopal Church's Sermons That Work, theoretically. I did one time. The only time I've ever had this happen, I was at a family reunion, and there's this little parish nearby where nearby where my dad grew up, and so it's kind of nearby where we stay. And, it's a little tiny church, which has all kinds of interesting dynamics going on that I don't particularly, whatever. Anyway, we showed up one Sunday, and they were doing morning prayer because the priest was gone, which was totally fine. Senior warden was doing morning prayer, and she stood up and she said, "This sermon was not written by me, nor was it written by Mother, whatever her name was, but it was written by," and I was like, oh, you got it all, Sermons at Work. So I listened to the sermon written by someone else. Anyway, you guys are better than that. You can write your own stuff. You're creative and brilliant and all those things. But and then I sent you a link that has a bunch of commentaries. There's actually bound commentaries in here too, in the church somewhere too, where you can look up a Bible passage, and somebody much smarter than I has written volumes on, Noah's blessings and curses. So anyway.
Commentaries are a good way to look at the original text if you don't know the language. That's one of the useful ones.
Yeah, they can tell you a lot about context and language and things like
Yeah,
that.
I own one, and sometimes when you can't figure out exactly, that's what I usually use it is for context. I don't know what their situation is.
Yeah, I found more and more. I mean, this is also because I've been doing this for a long time, and I've tackled all these readings at least 4 times now. So, I less and less look at commentaries, but they're extremely helpful when you're first starting. Because a lot, and you can buy them. I mean, there's a single volume commentary. There's several single volume commentaries you can find. Like I said, we've got here ones that fill up a shelf and a half that go into great depth and detail. That's kind of the thing. It's like how much depth and detail. And again, you're not going to sit there and cite a comment. You're not going to read somebody's commentary, but it'll at least help you churn ideas, and you can go, oh, I didn't realize that in, I don't know, whatever, I had always heard that the camel through the eye of the needle was a gate into Jerusalem, and I had always heard that, but this says that's completely not true, and that Jesus was saying that literally. And then you go, what is that all about then? And then the commentary you read on, it says, but the reason Jesus says this, and you go, oh, well, that's helpful. So anyway, I'm kind of making that. I have no idea if the commentary says that or not. That's an off-the-cuff commentary on a pretty...
Just make sure it doesn't theologically interpret it for you. So the commentary is going to give you a historical concept and its opinion of the work, but it's still its opinion, not necessarily yours.
Yeah, that's the thing. It can give you a lot of history. It can give you some background language stuff. Sometimes they can get into, that's true. And so this is, getting into what Chris was saying just before we started, which I think is, about you were talking about the Message, which is a paraphrase, and the various living translations too are also paraphrases. There's a handful, and they exist to be readable. Oh, come on, that's not nice. But yeah, they exist to be readable. It's to help you sit down and read the Bible like you would a novel. And so that has a use, but they're not scholarly in the sense of they're not precise enough to be scholarly. And they are very interpretive. The Message, Eugene Peterson, he was a pretty brilliant guy.
He's a great professor.
Yeah, I mean, he's written a ton of phenomenal stuff.
It says right in the preface, don't use this as scripture.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. So he did go to original sources, and, it definitely has a certain feeling of what a person in their 50s imagines teenagers in the 90s talked like. That's fine. But I mean, he was writing it to try to be readable, and so the Living Bible is another one of them. So if you get more accurate, NIV and NRSV are pretty good translations. They're scholarly ones. They're not the only ones, but those tend to be. If you want a readable Bible that's both, I should say, readable and a little bit better translated, the Jerusalem Bible is not a bad one. Although that is a little bit challenging because it was translated through French. So there is that. But it is much more readable, and it's a little bit better in its scholarship. I don't know. There's just tons and tons and tons of translations out there. And sometimes if you just have two or three, if you've ever sat with me in our class downstairs, I think, Phil, you sat through that, and how I gave everybody a different translation of the Bible, and then everybody go, but that's not what mine says, right? Well, then it gets you talking, right? So sometimes it's fun to let me look at this in two or three different translations, and it kind of is helpful to go, oh, I see that, it sounds so clean, and in my head it should be, I will make you fishers of men, but almost nobody actually translates it that way except for King James. Everybody else says, I will make you fish for people. The reason being is that the word for man in Greek is andros, and the word that Jesus uses in that particular passage is anthropy, which does not mean man as in man, but it means people. Anthropy? Anthropomorphic?
Yeah, it means men, man is the figurehead of all humanity. So there's a Christological central point there, but effectively, if you were to translate it that way, nobody would understand.
It means people.
So you have to.
It means people. Huh?
Yeah.
That's the idea of it. I mean, because there's no other real word for people as a generality other than anthropy.
So you could use the word for nation.
Well, ethnos, sure, but that's a different. Yeah, you could use ethnos. You could use.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. Theologically, the problem it becomes problematic because you end up trying to think about the theology that's behind it, and then you lose all your readers. So you just go, people's fine.
People's fine, right? This is where it's people. That's fine. We'll just go with people. Yeah, and so that's but you can look at these passages in various translations sometimes and go, oh, that's interesting that, another good example of this that I've run into is the Beatitudes, which by and large in English, because the King James did it, and it's such a well-known passage, they all translate it as blessed are, blessed are, blessed are, but you will find some that'll say things like fortunate are, or, lucky are. And it's actually really interesting this is one of the advantages of reading other languages too, is in Spanish, it's all it doesn't know what to do with that. And so every translation does those differently, which makes it very interesting. I don't know what the word is. Is it, because it's not the same word as,
It's fortunate.
yeah, because it's not the, I can't think of what the word, it's not blessing in the same way of Abraham's blessing. It is
It's
Makare. Anyway, because that means something to everybody, of course. Anyway.
Also, you have the example of red and reed seed.
Yeah, that's a whole other,
I've heard that before.
Yeah.
that was another translation that somehow, Anyway, the last link I gave you, which is one I tend to enjoy, I did this early in the week. Again, I don't like to listen to stuff. I like to give myself time to think about it. They give you the Working Preacher, which has the really recent comment, like they write commentaries weekly for this, and they invite theologians. Right? So it's out of Luther Seminary in Minneapolis. Mostly, here's the only thing. The RCL is mostly shared across most denominations. Mostly. Sometimes, on rare occasions, the Episcopal Church decided that we wanted to deviate from the RCL. And this comes up, the Revised Common Lectionary. So we have, when we adopted it in 2006, we made a small handful of exceptions. You go to the lectionary page, it'll all be the Episcopal Lectionary. But, so I point this out. Sometimes we and the Lutherans and the Methodists and the Presbyterians are not actually using the same readings because in 2006, the Episcopal Church said, we'll mostly use the RCL except second Sunday of Christmas, year C. Like, really random places, the third Sunday of Advent in year A. It's just these really not often, and it may only come up, once every, sometimes like that second Sunday of Christmas, just doesn't happen, but once every 9 years or something like that, but it doesn't happen much, but I'm saying that if you use another denomination's resources, just know there's this tiny, tiny little less than 1% chance that they'll be using different readings than us. Just have that caveat. That aside, they have a podcast where 4 biblical professors sit there and banter about the readings, and it's kind of fun to listen to them. And Caroline Lewis, who's one of them, did a...
Is this in this last link?
Yeah, the Working Preacher. So Working Preacher, they've got 4 biblical professors. They're all really phenomenal and brilliant and funny, and they're, they just kind of banter about the readings, and it's kind of fun to listen to. And sometimes you can pull things out of it, and sometimes, every once in a while, I'll go, that's not right, Rolf. You know better than that. But, anyway, they're fun to listen to, and they sometimes, but this site also has commentaries that are written, pretty much they'll get theologians from wherever to write commentaries for that week's readings that week. So they're very fresh too. So some of your commentaries may be 50, 60 years old. These will be, a month old. So that's kind of nice. It's a good source it just has a lot of good resources. I like their podcast because I enjoy listening to them. And then I think twice in the last 5 years I've come across one that I'm like, oh, that's not the same readings we're using. Oh, the other place that happens actually is the Episcopal Church likes to put major feast days in place of Sundays, and they don't. That's the other place that happens. So random times, August 6th is the Feast of the Transfiguration. And that's just proper 37 or something, and they'll be talking about proper whatever it is. And, our readings will be the Transfiguration. And it just happens sometimes, but it's not. I don't want to scare you, but I'm just saying that you may want to make sure, you may want to just check if you're listening to their podcast for your ideas that we're actually reading the same things, which 99% of the time we are.
So who all uses the RCL?
Most of the Anglican Communion does. And I don't know whether or not, I don't know whether or not that we all have exactly the same RCL. I don't know if ours in the Church of England always, there may be those places too, I'm just not sure. It's never come up in the small handful of times I've preached in the Church of England that we've had separate readings because we've just had the same ones. But so most of the Anglican Communion uses it. The Lutheran Church ELCA uses it. PCUSA, the Presbyterians use it. The United Methodists can use it. Okay, but this is the other... Well, so this is the other funny thing about being an Episcopalian is we tend to standardize things a lot better than a lot of other denominations, you know. So, like, as it happens, Luther Seminary, the same place that puts out this podcast, also has, and you got to watch this, they themselves published a different, a 4-year lectionary called the Narrative Lectionary. So you don't want to, like, listen to the stuff about the Narrative Lectionary, although you could. I mean, it's not going to hurt you, but it won't be the same readings. So, like, the LCA has the option to use the Narrative Lectionary as opposed to the RCL. The Methodist Church can use it, or they can just do whatever they want. They kind of don't have rules. Yeah, they don't have many rules, whatever. Anyway, they have different, their rules work differently than ours, we'll say that, because they do have like a book of discipline and stuff that we don't have. Anyway, so by and large, most mainline denominations use the RCL. The Roman Catholic Church uses a lectionary that is very similar and mostly coincides, but does not always. Well, that was a lectionary they developed during Vatican II, which we adapted for the BCP lectionary, and then the RCL spun off. Actually, there was originally a common lectionary and the revised common. So that's what I have on all the resources to use. And like I said, I emailed it all to you, so you can just click on the links and enjoy it. And I'll just talk about how to develop a sermon. All right. I'll argue it the whole time.
Yep. We have to get through the day somehow. All right, so I got 5 steps for you on how to write a sermon, or how I write a sermon. So first step is usually to locate, and then read the passages in English. You can read it in a couple different translations if you want, but usually I would find a tried and tested one that I like. So I like the RSV, so I'll use the RSV. The reason why I like the RSV is because the RSV does a good job at representing the Greek words through it in an understandable English way. The NRSV does an equally good job, I should say equally, a slightly worse job, but it is more readable. If that doesn't, so if you're not afraid of like anachronistic words, or not anachronistic, but just older words, you can do the RSV. If you want more of an updated language, more of like a 21st century language, you can do the NRSV. If you're more comfortable with like an NIV, that's fine with you. It's really personal preference. I just like the RSV.
I don't know, the RSV has a great line in the Psalm that says, "I will take no gold from you."
Mm-hmm. It's true. I ain't taking no go.
The BCP is like, I will accept no bullocks from your house.
Mm-hmm.
I'll take no gold from you.
See? All right, so but then I like to read those. I'll read them a couple times, and then I'll try and figure out what the theme is. So, like, I prefer to take all 3 passages or 2 passages, if I can't get the third one to fit, and weave them together. That's just how I've always done it. That's what I like to do. If you want to choose one passage, that's fine. But what you need to do is you need to become familiar with the passage. I don't mean memorize it. I just mean become familiar. Once you have that template of what that passage looks like to you, the second step I like to do is I like to go to the Greek and check what I've thought. You can do this not knowing Greek by looking in the commentaries. Or comparing translations. Yeah, or comparing translations. That's when you move out from this is what I think to let's check if I'm heretical. Usually your point most of the time is to check and make sure that you're on a acceptable path as opposed to the right path. So there's no right way to preach something. There's just acceptable ways. It's like I was always explained to me that if you're standing in the batter's box of a baseball stadium, you can hit into the field of play, but you can't hit out of the field of play. Heresy's out of the field of play. Good preaching is in the field of play. Yeah. Right, because we're double checking to make sure that, the priest didn't just commit a heresy, which sometimes I say a little louder. Yeah, and that also, like, if you're going to pull in some theological stuff, that's a good time to pull in the theology. So one of my go-to guys is reading Origen. I love him. Or Bart, two guys who I've really done a lot of reading of. And what? Yeah, that's true. Bart, you shouldn't read Bart though, because Bart's really voluminous and really tedious. But usually you just find a guy that you, or a gal that you like. It could be anybody, but as long as you like what they're saying and you can understand it, it provides depth for you, that's a good theological resource. You know, you could be using that stuff Father Matt just put online, but it's really what sort of teaches you and helps you craft a better sermon. So then step 3 is I basically try and write a summary. So the way that I personally write summaries is I write it in poetry. So I'll write a sonnet that I'll read out in the beginning of my sermon. It provides, for me, this poetry provides a different type or a different way to interact with a text, right? So I can stand here and I can lecture, I can stand here and I can preach. But if I write you a poem, I'm going to force you to think about my words with more significance on each word. And that's why I like that. Now, you might choose to do it in a different way. You could literally paint a picture if you were particularly inclined with that. But you really kind of just got to get the point across. And I like to do it by adding an extra flair and an extra viewpoint to what I'm doing.
I think that's actually something that I really appreciate for preaching a lot, because I think it's a level of creativity that very few preachers have.
Thanks. I also, and I've done this before, I think Matt, I've done this once. I did that one at St. Matt's, where I actually wrote a hymn that followed my sermon. So I reinforce what I just said by making everybody sing it, which is a little bit hubris, but also gets the point across.
You know, a lot of people will tell stories.
Over here.
I have not ever written a hymn.
It's actually really easy. You just go to the back of the Methodist handbook, and they have all of it written out in in a poetic style, and then you just manipulate the hymn to fit what you want to say.
But a lot of people tell like anecdotes or do other ways of trying to illustrate.
Yeah. I mean, you could think of it this way, right? We've all probably heard a sermon where the guy started out, or the gal started out saying something like, this one time when I was in Jersey City, and they tell you a story about it. That's basically the same thing. It's just now it's just more directly tied in to your sermon itself. I think it would be really cool if someone did try to do a painting and talked about the division of a painting for 2 minutes and then went and did their sermon.
The President of the House of Bishops at General Convention did one where it was not one of hers, but it was a Caravaggio, where she just preached a sermon. It was the scene of that particular gospel reading, and she did one where, I think it was pre-recorded, but where she would zoom in on this corner and talk about what was happening here. It was kind of interesting, maybe more for out of our history sense than theologically, but it was interesting.
Yeah, and I don't mean this this isn't like a Bob Ross type situation. You're not standing there painting it yourself. It's just, you're just trying to give a snippet. You're trying to say, this is what I'm going to say. And you're going to do that over and over and over again. All good sermons, if you haven't repeated your point at least 3 times, they're not going to get it. Usually I get about 7.
7 times in 7 different ways.
Yep, it gets almost, you feel as if it's painful because you're sitting there going, oh my God, I just said this 4 times. I can't believe they don't understand it. But their ears are coming to it cold and yours aren't.
We had a priest who used to tell at least 3 anecdotes, and at the end of the 3rd one, there was some audible sighing. It was like, oh no, he's not gonna stop.
No, yeah, that sounds painful.
It was awful.
As a side note, I try and keep my preaching under 12 minutes because we all got places to be, and the Book of Common Prayer is not brief, ever.
Yeah, I always feel like I have great stories to tell when I'm just having casual conversation, but when I am trying to come up with something to say in a sermon, then I go, if I told this one, I have 3, then I told this one.
Yeah, I almost never use stories, only when they're intense. I don't use frivolous stories myself, but it just fits my personality.
You don't want how your dog, you know,
Got hit by a car.
yeah, whatever, right? And so yeah, I mean that is the challenge of, you know, if the anecdote is too if the anecdote overshadows your teaching, then you just told an anecdote.
Right.
That's-
Right. So those are your first 3 steps, and at this point, you pretty much have a summary. You have the game plan going forward. Now, this would be the point where I would select the type of sermon I was going to give if you're so inclined to use the thing that Father Matt gave us in the first week. But effectively, the 4th step is you just go and you write the sermon. Now, that might start out as a stream of consciousness for you. The longer and the more you do it, the more you'll start to realize that you don't have to make it a stream of consciousness, and you can edit it while you're writing it. But you need to get a volume of work that you can move and mold. So personally, I'm in the weird situation of when I write my sermons, I actually write them short and I add to them because that's just how my brain works, and I like truncated ideas. A lot of people, I found most people actually like to write a lot and then cut. So whatever fits you best, but rarely do you ever just get it right on the first try, especially if you're inexperienced with it. Like, sure, I was joking at church last Sunday. I'm like, yeah, you could call me up with 2 hours notice and I'll be able to provide a decent sermon. But 1, it's experience, and 2, it's not going to be as polished as like if I've had 4 hours or 6 hours to think about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of us just, well, of course we had that whole year where we did every single day.
Right. Yeah, we did.
Why did we do that?
We preached for 6 months every single day, switching off with each other.
Because you know, we were allowed to do Sunday morning worship. We did morning prayer every morning and preach every morning for I think it was longer than 6 months.
It taught you so fast how to preach. Like, you were just like, okay, how do I? Because you didn't want to prepare anything the night before.
Yeah, this is the first time I'm hearing these readings,
Mhm.
so here's my hot take today.
Yep. Hot Mess Express, multiple days.
3 minutes sermon.
Oh yeah. They basically just ended up being explanations of this.
Yeah,
of this.
there's little expositions of the readings.
But they were good for the 2 people who watched.
I was gonna say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We did not have a cult following. Let's just say that.
No, I think there were a few people. There were some random people that were watching that, when we stopped, I got a couple messages why aren't you doing morning prayer anymore? I was like,
I want to go to sleep. And then your final step is editing and practicing. So you're going to want to practice. And usually when you practice with yourself in a mirror so you can work on your facial expressions, or you practice in front of a loved one who can give you feedback. The problem with practicing with a loved one is that until they're ready to be like, nah, that one sucked, you can't really trust that they're not blowing smoke up your ass. So my wife has done that before. She's like, oh, it's okay. And then I go to the sermon, go to the pulpit, and it bombs. And I'm just like, was it really okay? She's like, well, I wasn't going to tell you. I'm like, you were supposed to tell me. So, well, now she does, because she knows that I'm going to tell her if it bombed.
And in Marines, we call that a burglary. You give your wife on a brief or a scheme of fighting, or, here's what we're going to do. And you have 3 or 4 guys, your buddies sit there, and it was a burglary. I mean, everything that you did that sucked.
Mm-hmm.
They would tell me.
You change that, and that, absolutely. You can't have it. That's good.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's right. And then this is usually the time too where you have turn of phrases. They start coming in. So I've noticed when I work, I'll end up with my original sort of clay, and then I'll start finding ways of saying things that will catch people's ears. You'll use assonance, or you'll use repetition, or you can create sub themes that are going on too. That because I might be preaching to Joe Schmo over here who's only going to get 1 bit, but then the guy in the back might be theologically well educated, so he's looking for a little bit more. So I'll throw in a few extra layers that the people who wouldn't get it, they'll just miss, and it's okay. But the person in the back, like, oh, that's a new take that I haven't heard before.
Oddly, I found that most people who are theologically educated tend to be a lot more gracious.
Mm-hmm. That's true too.
The weird feedback I get that makes no sense sense usually comes from people that are like, come on.
Yep. And then that's it. Then you eat a good breakfast and get up there and deliver. Your hands are probably shaking the first time you do it, but the butterflies go away pretty quickly when you're. Yeah.
Well, we have a very sympathetic audience here, because you're irritated. I had, some stumbles,
Why were you tomatoes?
well, yeah, I'm waiting for Bobby Marty's this week,
Yeah.
which is cool too.
Mm-hmm. So any questions on that?
No, that's a good,
Yeah, I mean,
that's a great line, I read the passage, and I use our Bible study plan, read it.
Oh, it's a great way to do it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And then I found the things
Wow.
Show off.
that stuck with me, and then I started writing, and I've only got, I don't want to talk.
That's probably fine for the passage. Yeah, and
Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, do kind of think too, like if you wanna, you don't have to stick to the styles that I outlined, but if one of those is useful to you, let us know what style you're using. Actually, that's a really good method, though. I hadn't thought about using doing a Lectio Divina kind of.
Is that what it is?
Well, the reason is I'm not super theologically educated, so when I read that, I'm sure I've read that before, I'm sure I've seen it before, but I don't
I guess it is like Divina, isn't it?
sphere of knowledge, so when I read this, I'm like, ooh, what's the point? So that helped me define kind of what stuck with me. And then, so the reading that we're doing is like super long, is that the reading that would be the reading?
No, I think
Sure.
No, I looked in the Proverbs, it's broken up between like 3 or 4
So can you,
segments.
that was my question, because I found a couple of things that really stuck with me. For a 5-minute sermon, you don't have to touch on everything, right?
No, you couldn't. Not that's part of the challenge of that passage is that it's like a drop kick to the face. Like Paul is not pulling punches, and Paul speaks very fast in a very concise way. So he might say about 8 different theological points, which you could never preach about all at once, or unless you were Baptist, and even then they try and they fail.
Well,
Yeah.
that's the thing. You don't have to hit the whole. You don't have to preach on the entire passage. I mean, you could a word or a phrase. I wouldn't go with word or phrase because that'd be.
I mean, that's its own stumbling point at the opposite end.
But like,
Because then that's what you heard.
yeah,
Right.
you get a chunk of it that really speaks to you, or maybe the whole passage is a theme.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's so many ways of doing it.
I mean, the safest way is just to try and understand what Paul is saying, and then try and make a sermon around what you think he's saying.
We did
See, that's where I'm glad you said that, because I've read it through the NIV and the RSV
And the message.
twice, slowly, quietly, in quiet, so I could read it. And I thought, man, there's so much in here, I want to study this, I want to talk about it.
Oh, yeah, I thought it
Because
was
I was-
extremely full of content.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the first time I read it, I was freaking out. I'm like, really? These 2 dudes think we're going to pull this off?
Well, see, and that's why I went with the style of.
That was a good idea.
The Bible study, because I read that, and like, man, this could be a 3-hour lecture, with what he's talking about, and I just pick a couple things out.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I heard a lot about promise in it.
Okay, yeah, that's true.
About how, don't worry, because this is not going to happen.
I
Mm-hmm.
heard a lot of parenting.
Yeah.
With the size, the Holy Spirit size that can't even be imagined.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, it's like, just come home on time. Get home on time, and you can do this again.
Tell me where you are.
Tell me where you are, and you can do this again. And then they don't, and you're like, oh.
I'm feeling
And
myself.
I mean, that the Holy Spirit side, like holy smokes, that's my life, it's like, so.
Oh, that's brilliant. But what a great, no, but see, stuff like that is so great because that's relatable.
Well, and then one thing that I'm not sure I'm gonna go with or not was my kids were adopted. And the pastor talks about related to being adopted by
Oh my
the Spirit, and I'm like, that might be a little bit much, because I could weave that in.
Mm-hmm.
They lost everything, they lost their
so their siblings and everything else, but they were adopted into our family, which is what
And some of it was really, to me, struck out, like I said, I wanted to study it and be told things. Like, some of it is such big theology that there's no way I'm tackling it. Like, it's about the sonship. You know, and I'm thinking,
translated it.
really? So am I fine? So did I just become?
Yes.
Oh, see, you're an ace of Leon.
And I thought, well, I'm not preaching on that.
Was it Leon or Alexander?
2 weeks is not enough for me
Leon.
to study enough to say that.
God became human so that humanity may become divine.
Yes, that's a
I
very
it was a snippet.
that it's much more complicated than that. But yeah, I mean he's basically what Augustine will say later says that I become more so, or I become less, so God will become more in me.
We did pick a long passage.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
really good though.
Yeah, it is good.
Yeah.
I love it.
Maybe we shouldn't have done this while sitting in a brewery.
No, here. So if you're
So that's how we get on.
This is how we planned this whole class. We just sat in a brewery.
here, if you're having trouble with it though, go to work and read it at work. That's another way of dealing with this. If your head is buzzing too much because it's too quiet, go read it in a public place where you can't have that opportunity, and you'll find that it'll be more succinct to you. Yeah, it's a way of stopping you from obsessing yourself.
Actually, I think the reason we picked this is it's a funeral passage
Mm-hmm.
that they usually cut lots of chunks out of. But you hear this one a lot at funerals. I think that was where we came up with it, and then we just didn't cut out all the chunks.
Right. Sonship.
That was what we did. Huh?
That is exactly what we did.
Yeah.
Sonship is an interesting idea.
Mhm.
Yeah. Or walking into our own divinity.
Out of the intersection for us with groanings which cannot be uttered.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't use the language you want to use when they come home late.
We read together a book on prayer here probably 25 years ago. How long have I been in here? 25 years ago. And it was one of the Episcopal Church, I'm not sure who did it, put out it was like 11 books. And it was essentially how to pray and all the different ways to pray.
Oh yeah.
And it really struck me, I still have it, and I was really glad I took it, because later times in my life, when I was going through really hard times, that I learned that just because I can't formulate a prayer doesn't mean I'm not hurt. You know, the fact that you're seeking the presence is enough, because God knows you.
That is very profound.
It is, and when you give that up, like now today my brother was in court on a terrible thing, and I had no idea what to pray for, and that's just what I told God. You just need to be in this, because I don't even know what to ask yet.
Yeah.
There's
Just be there.
one of those like great rabbi stories about some rabbi who used to say, apparently would go to bed every night and say, God, you've been watching me all day, you know what's on your heart, it's yours now.
Yeah, George can do that. George will go to bed and he kind of does what's done is done and what's undone is undone, and now I'm giving it to you and I'm going to sleep.
Mm-hmm.
And my anxiety's going, what? How do you do that? I gotta think about this.